We're going to be reconvening an open session. And in light of a conversation we had the other day in benefits and services about the wonderful numbers we have of the members that we have that are reaching 100. I just want to let everybody know that I signed 29 100-year letters, birthday letters, for the month of September. Out of the 29, 25 are women.
For men.
So, and I think for the other conversation. And I think for July and August, I signed over 20 for both of those months too. I mean, so that's pretty incredible. We do have a long living workforce. Alrighty. Saying that, we are going to.
Clean living.
I got to knock on wood somewhere. Our informational items, number 3, the long-term facilities plan update. We're to you, Lisa, if you'd like to introduce everyone.
Okay,
please.
I will. I'm going to start, though, by saying today's presentation is the culmination of 4 years of planning and hard work by many people to provide the board with an analysis of the alternatives available for CalSTR's long-term facilities plan. We identified in 2014 that at the rate our organization was growing, we could be out of space within the next 2 years, or 2016. And that led us to a workplace study that was conducted by JLL and recommendations to optimize our existing space. So over the next few years, we implemented those recommendations and we were able to add an additional 200 seats to our existing facility, which provided growth room until fiscal year 1920. In July 2016, we provided the board with a net present value analysis on several alternatives to provide a long-term solution to our space needs. And the board asked staff to provide additional information and logistics around the alternative to expand on-site using existing entitlements and then lease available space to third parties. In November of 2016, we presented the board with that scenario and a budget based on high-level assumptions and consistent with our current building's fit and finish. The board elected not to make a final decision at that meeting, but did authorize $181 million be placed in a building fund and provided limited authority to spend $8 million for the purpose of hiring necessary parties to prepare a design for an expansion facility to be brought back for their review. At the same time, the board directed staff to further research the ability to acquire an asset to retrofit for our needs and look into leasing for the long term. So we've provided you progress of our efforts along the way and the methodology that would be used to provide a recommendation to the board on the best value for CalSTR's long term. So today is the day that we can provide you the results of that analysis. So let me introduce your presenters today. Beside me is Giselle Geiger, CalSTR's planning manager, who's been leading the expansion design activities. She will walk you through the process that has led up to the target value budget that will be presented today. Jennifer Ortiz, Vice President with JLL, will be providing you the assumptions used in the analysis and results of the financial component. Aaron Patterson, Vice President with JLL, will be providing you with a qualitative component of the analysis and JLL's final recommendation. And then to my right is Aaron Laurel, City Manager with the City of West Sacramento, who will be providing you the economic perspective of our presence here in Sacramento, West Sacramento. I think the presentation today should cover the individual requests and interests of all of the board members, but we would really appreciate your feedback and questions along the way so we can determine how to put together the November board material so that way you can make a final decision in November. So if that feels okay to you, please feel comfortable in providing questions and anything concrete that you think needs to come back to you in November when you make that decision. So I will pass it on to our first presenter, and that's Giselle.
Good morning. So I will be walking you through our target value design and budget process. And I just want to remind you that the way we started this process was to model from the phase 1 building. So we began a budget development process looking at the budget of the phase 1 building and with a goal of creating a design for an expansion that was of a similar look and feel to this phase 1 building. Now, in 2016, we identified the initial elements of our building program and including the overall building size and number of occupants, we worked to align those with our development agreement for the parcel. We used a model to forecast building elements using the Phase 1 budget as a starting point, and a cost estimator was engaged to validate assumptions. However, the layout and specific building features were not complete. Staff completed best practice research and identified CalSTR's goals for the project: to recruit highly trained staff to secure the financial future of our members, make fiduciary sound decisions to enhance services to members and employers, to achieve a high degree of sustainability, and to manage the costs of the building. The expansion building designed by ZGF is consistent in programmatic elements with the building we initially identified. In 2016, we identified a 194,000 square foot building with 8 floors, approximately 162 seats per floor, assuming that we would build out 2 floors initially. The final design is for 183,000 USF, or 5 floors, with approximately 240 seats per floor. DPR, our general contractors, used the building design developed by ZGF and an architectural narrative to develop itemized takeoffs for each building element. And then we worked together as an integrated team with the designers and general contractors and our other consultants to produce a design that provides the best value to CalSTRs and aligns with those initial cost estimates. So our 2016 estimate identified an 8-story tower over a 6-story parking garage. The plan was to build out the garage, ground floor retail, and only complete office floors as CalSTRs or a tenant occupied the space. So our upfront costs were just $6 million of TI for those first 2 floors. But the item did identify a $46 million amount of future office TIs. The total cost of that budget you were presented in 2016 was $226 million. Now, we've gone through with our architects to design the building, and based on the expansion design and the openness of the space and the adjacencies that we'd like to achieve, the best path forward for CalSTRs is to occupy the space 100% upfront. We've also received feedback from the market, from our developers and other consultants, that the Phase 1 building would be more marketable as a leased asset. It is available to preview now, and it is a space that's a little bit more traditional. So that is the path that we've pursued as we've developed this budget. So when we look at the movement in these numbers, when we started with our $226.7 million, we had included those future TI costs, and those TI costs were simply for the initial occupancy, not considering lease turnover. Well, we faced 20% inflation over the past 2 years, and that's really due to constraints in the construction market. Of inflationary costs associated with labor and construction increased the total costs by 10% per year based on market conditions. So reviewing ENR, the cost of labor has gone up significantly, and there is a labor crunch in this area. We estimate an additional 6% in escalation to the midpoint of construction as well. So our overall inflation numbers have gone up significantly. The difference then, if we exclude inflation and escalation from the 2 budgets, is $14.4 million. Those increases are a majority of on-site energy production, and then reevaluated fees based on having that building design and being able to cost out the fees for utilities, building permits, et cetera. If we look at individual increases, to just give you a few scenarios, things like site work have gone up. When we pulled plans and did a survey, we were able to discover utilities under the sidewalk that we would need to move to be able to build the building to the boundaries of the site. Once we had a GC on board, they could actually evaluate the conditions here
and learn that they were going to have to work uniquely to build directly adjacent to an existing structure. So mobilization, construction staging are higher costs than we initially assumed. Again, the increased complexity of mechanical systems required for Z&E is an increase to the construction costs. The full scope of public space tenant improvements is higher. But at the same time, we did experience decreases. So our office tenant improvements will be lower because we are doing simpler interiors, more open interiors. And some of our professional fees are lower because we're using an integrated approach to construction. I want to walk you through the target value design and budget results. In July, we presented a design that was our initial conceptual design, and we had not gone through the budgeting process yet. We took that design and worked together to align it with a budget that could be reasonably in line with what we started from, our $181 million, considering the inflation factors. So we worked to identify desk size consistent with the market, and we also aligned conference room quantities with the needs of CalSTRS. We incorporated a concrete structure to increase energy efficiency and access to daylight, and we simplified the parking layout to avoid duplicate construction on ramps. We've also evaluated parking to make sure that we have the best access to public parking so that we can open up that revenue stream as well. We've realigned equipment on the roof area to maximize open space for photovoltaic panels. We've designed a 5-floor space instead of the taller initial 8-floor space, which has fewer requirements for elevators. It's both a construction savings and an operation cost savings over the long run. So if we have fewer elevators, we have fewer service agreements, we have fewer risks. And we have fewer energy demands based on elevators. We've designed natural ventilation for the parking garage, and that reduces our overall equipment requirements, so that reduces costs for the building. We developed the bridge solution, we enhanced the bridge solution and engineered it so that it would work with the existing structure here. Once we looked at what was in the wall, we determined that the best solution was a smaller bridge that connects between the two buildings. And that will reduce the strain on the security desk and allow more connectivity between staff. We're maintaining that phase 1 area as leasable area with the idea that that has the highest rent potential. And the other thing that's really been successful in this process is having our general contractor on our team from this outset. So our general contractor has partnered with us and has been with us to evaluate all of these costs. We're not going through a value engineering process. So they have participated, they have evaluated constructability of all of the designs, and it allows us to get to a budget that we're confident in. The budget has over $27 million of contingency in it, and we're confident that that's not a contingency we're eating up for additional design features. That contingency is really to address market risks and construction risks. Potentially, if there's an increase in cost due to tariffs, we want to be ready for that. Also, if there's any risks associated with permitting or fire and life safety, we want to be prepared for any changes we might have to make in those events. And when we've been developing this design, we are thinking as an owner-operator. And so we're really looking at mechanical systems that we're going to be able to maintain over time and reduce our long-term costs. And with that, I can take any questions regarding our budget process before we pass it off to Jennifer to go through the quantitative analysis.
Do we have any questions from the board on the budget? I think we understood that. Thank you, Giselle.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Giselle. Thanks for having us here again. You know, JLL takes a lot of pride in being part of this partnership with CalSTRS, and understands and appreciates the need to have a fully vetted and transparent process here. So we've gone through these slides with you previously, so I will be very light on them unless you have any questions. The one thing I would like to open with is that we are helping and partnering with CalSTRS to solve a challenge here, and that is the need to increase occupancy in a site to accommodate headcount and business operational growth. And so with that being said, the three options that we are looking at with CalSTRS are the HQ expansion, the acquisition of a building, or the leasing scenario. And our overall project approach has gone from data discovery, market analytics, to financial modeling, a qualitative analysis, and then today we'll be prepared to present our conclusions and recommendations. The alternative scenarios that we've identified again are the HQ expansion, which is to develop and build a second office building expanding the existing campus, the acquisition of an existing building within the metro area, or a lease scenario where we lease space to accommodate that same headcount growth. And again, there are many variables under consideration within each scenario that we're focusing on here. And this goes to speak to both the qualitative and quantitative analysis. We're looking at things like potential lease up for third parties in both the HQ expansion and acquisition. We're thinking about business disruption to CalSTRS operations, the capacity and flexibility and functionality of the workspace for CalSTRS workforce, again, which ties back to operational efficiencies as well. And then within the acquisition and lease scenario, just underscoring that we are undertaking this analysis based on what's available today, and those assumptions could change over time depending on what is on the market at the time of need moving forward. And with that, the acquisition and lease asset selection process was an exhaustive one, including market research, asset criteria identification, looking at those aspects of CalSTRS office space requirements based on a variety of factors, including the status quo, which is today's office tower, as well as a state agency comparison, and also collection of data related to CalSTRS' current occupancy and forecasted growth. We conducted a variety of stakeholder interviews and considered growth considerations and other operational requirements of CalSTRS. We then went to market within JLL, supported by our transactions and research team, to see what was available on the market today for both acquisition or leasing scenarios, as well as looked at space that is being quietly marketed, so not actively or publicly marketed, and tapped our markets team for information on tenants that they knew were moving out of space, future vacancies coming online, et cetera, that could also be considered for future occupancy. And then we evaluated all those assets that we identified as potential candidates and slimmed those down to be able to compare an acquisition option and leasing option against the HQ expansion. And this is just a geographic overview of some of those options that we considered. And you'll see CalSTRS building on there, as well as both the acquisitions and leasing options mapped out. And these are just some visual examples of buildings that are currently available or being softly marketed within the Sacramento metro, just as a visual. And then in terms of the asset criteria identified, again, looking at things like the status quo, what this current tower currently holds, and also as well as a state agency comparison, and looking at the kind of factors such as what we have available in this current tower. Do we need to replicate those things, such as an assembly room, conference rooms, et cetera? We have a list of these attributes, which includes break rooms, pantries, huddle rooms, on-site cafe, gym, bicycle cages, retail, and then we also looked at LEED and zero net energy mandates, on-site childcare, parking, conferencing. And so what we looked at were are these criteria that are being required or desired? Does the acquisition opportunity out there on the market have those attributes? Does a lease option have those attributes? And this is what we found across the board. We tried to hone in on options that best fit the bill. Any questions on that?
We have Harry.
Yeah.
On this slide here, all of these, cafe, gym, bicycle library, bicycle cages, that whole list, right? Given the size and magnitude of the potential project, what's the actual impact of the cost associated with, a bicycle cage?
So the way we looked at, so that wasn't part of our financial modeling, for example. This more went into our qualitative analysis and selection of the assets that we would compare against. So when you look at bicycle cages, for example, it's an amenity feature. So there's not necessarily a proven out cost or benefit to that financially or quantitatively. What we think about is, especially in this particular case where the current CalSTRS occupancy, the current Tower 1 has these features, what is that impact on both the workforce and visitors to the building if they don't have that same access in a different location or in the expansion? How does that compare? So, and that qualifies with all of these attributes where we're really thinking about what are, not necessarily what the wants were, but what were the basic identified needs of what CalSTRS would, require in a future office space. Yeah. And as we get into the more qualitative analysis, we'll see more how some of these things do feed into employee attraction and retention and service to the members and beneficiaries.
Yeah, that was helpful because, from my perspective, we should do all of these things and more to enhance the quality of an experience where people are spending at least 8 hours of their day, 40 hours of the week, and we want to attract people into the public sector to work in places that they feel good. And the costs associated with these types of amenities are minimal relative to the overall size of the project.
Right. And I mean, if you take something, for example, like childcare on site, the HQ expansion, for example, does consider that, but we didn't consider that a definite requirement of a facility that we would need down the road. So when we went out to market and looked at what options were out there for purchase or lease, that wasn't an attribute, that was a check. That wasn't something that we said, okay, we need childcare.
Right. So since you raised that one, Erin, and this is my last point, I feel very passionate about childcare on site for new families. Where people don't have to make a decision, can I go to work and can I find childcare? Can I afford it? Can I get my kids there? And we know and we're an educational organization. That's a little bit in the weeds, but I wanted to put a little flag in the ground for that one. It's essential for so many families.
Oh, yeah. I have 2 of my own children, so I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Anything else?
No, that's it. Thanks.
Alrighty, thanks. Go ahead.
Any
Erin.
other questions? Okay. All right, so with that, I will hand it over to Jennifer, who will touch on our financial analysis.
Thank you, Erin. Hi, everyone. I wanted just to refresh our memories on some of the points that we have spoken about previously. And the model that we have developed here and focusing on a 30-year analysis period that begins June of 2019, which is Q3 of FY19 for CalSTRS, and honing in on the specifics that we were taking account into the analysis are the focusing on the occupancy projection, which is based on CalSTRS headcount growth. Starting at 4.5% annually, that gradually decreased to 2.5% in a decade. And the square footage requirement on a per seat basis is based on the assumption of 150 square feet per person or per seat for all scenarios. You're gonna see the market assumption in a following presentation, and I wanted to kind of walk you through them a bit more in detail as in terms of the key assumptions that you were taking account into this model in a quantitative analysis. The key factors that we take into account across all scenarios are have been vetted in a three-pronged validation approach. We validated with CalSTRS on the occupancy and headcount growth projection. We validated the costs associated with each scenarios with the GCs and construction team and who developed the construction budget. And we also validated the lease rate assumptions with the JLL market as well as the research team. Both the direct lease rate that CalSTRS will be potentially paying on leasing the third-party space as well as leasing the existing space to third-party to achieve parking as well as office income, lease income to accommodate to offset the costs associated with running the managing and owning the building themselves. And moving on, I wanted to kind of highlight the key assumptions used across all three scenarios. So I want to sit on this page for a few minutes here and want to bring your attention to the HQ expansion first. We are looking at developing a building that contains 5 floors of office space as well as amenity spaces, including a parking structure that sits on top of a parking structure. Together with the parking structure, we're looking at close to 513,000 square feet of building gross square footage. In terms of the actual occupiable usable square footage, it's approximately 226,000 square feet. Without going into the details of the construction cost that Giselle has gone over already, just wanted to kind of focus on the total cost here that will be incurred in order to achieve the HQ expansion upfront in FY 18 and 19. That's approximately $300 million. And the operating expenses that are associated with the HQ expansion is modeled after the budgeted building operating expenses for this current tower. So it starts at $18.16 per square feet, $18.16 per square feet, but with the zero net energy saving, we were able to achieve $16.41 per square feet for the operating expenses. The assumption here is CalSTRS will occupy, once the expansion building is developed, CalSTRS will occupy 4 floors of existing tower and move majority of the staff over to the new building and turn around and able to lease existing space in Tower 1 to third parties. And the leasing rate CalSTRS is able to achieve by leasing existing space starts at $3 a square foot with an annual increase of 4% year over year. And there is a cost associated with leasing the existing space to a third party, and it's the estimate of cost is 3.35% of lease commission that CalSTRS will have to pay for the market to lease the space to a third party. In addition to that, there will be a $20 of estimated TI, tenant improvement allowances to third-party tenant. CalSTRS will be able to offer the third-party tenants, and in order to convert the third-party lease space back to CalSTRS use over time as CalSTRS headcount grows, requires those space back to be occupied by CalSTRS, we're looking at approximately $50 a square foot to update those space for CalSTRS to reoccupy. Now, we want to be conservative in our approach when it comes to estimating the third-party lease income. So we've incorporated a 20% of lease vacancy in our analysis so that the assumption is not 100% of the space that are available for third-party lease will be leased up, and only 80% of it will be able to generate sublease third-party lease income. And what's also taken into account here is there will be a 6 month of a downtime in order to lease up the space. So we will not be achieving the lease income on day one to the full extent. Any questions? I want to make sure I'm going through a lot of the information. I want to take a quick pause here. Okay. All right. Moving on to the acquisition scenario. We looked at buildings in the marketplace that will meet CalSTR's requirement, that's similar to the tower, the existing headquarter tower here, as well as in terms from an environmental standpoint, make sure that this building we can potentially acquire will also meet the energy efficiency requirement from a LEED certification standpoint. So we looked at all qualified building that could potentially be available for acquisition in the downtown metro market. And we were able to identify the square footage of the building that we can potentially acquire around 348,000 square feet. And with that, the total acquisition cost includes not only just the cost to purchase the building, but also cost to fit out the building to meet CalSTR's occupancy needs and workplace standards. So we're looking at the $366 million starting FY 20 and 21 on achieving that, that goal. And just to kind of keep, want to make sure that you're aware, this $366 million, some of the costs will be spent over time. Not 100% of that $366 million will be spent on day one.
Jennifer, it occurs to me, I don't know why I didn't earlier, that we would, any of the buildings that we were looking at in the downtown metro area, these are all buildings that exist. They're all buildings that have tenants. So if we were to acquire a building and need to move into it, we would actually have to evict someone. Or if their lease was terminated, we'd have to ask them to go somewhere else.
Right, so that was taken account into the analysis in the modeling process. So we assumed the building that we are looking at, that which will become available for sale for acquisition, there will be a amount of space that will be available in a building in the near term. So in the occupancy projection, CalSTR will not be taking occupancy for 100, moving any of the existing employees from the current building to the new building on day one. Instead, you'll be achieving by starting with 30,000 square feet, and the buildings that we have looked at will definitely have immediate need availability for 30,000 square feet. And as time goes on, once CalSTR take ownership of the building, you will have control over moving the existing tenants as well as vacating them to make room. So it depends on the actual availability of the building that you're acquiring. And for the modeling purpose, we looked at building that will definitely be able to accommodate. And therefore, we found a building that's slightly bigger than what you would need, but will provide enough space for CalSTR to occupy on day one.
I want to make sure I understand what you just told us. We're looking at buildings that we know when we purchase it, that within a near term, we'd have available at least 30,000 square feet. Did you say that we wouldn't be able to break existing leases? So the availability, say the building's 100% occupied, except for that 30,000, we wouldn't be able to move into it any further until leases expire?
So just,
Because that's what I thought I heard you say, so I'm not
I
sure.
just want to clarify. So that's not the case. So it's based on assumption, right? So we don't have a specific building in mind for this model purposes. We want to make sure that we acquire a building that's large enough. So it'll have more than just 30,000 square feet, and obviously there will be multiple tenants in the building, and there will be multiple lease expiration days that's staggered. We will have flexibility, and once you take over the ownership of the building, you will have a flexibility of moving tenants. Yeah. Again, I just want to keep this is an assumption. So once we are able to identify a building that you can actually acquire, then we can definitely digging a little deeper on when the timing of the move.
Thank you.
Sure. So in terms of the acquired building, we're looking at CalSTRS occupying as much as they need based on their growth projection. So for the remaining of the floor, if the CalSTRS are not occupying, they will be collecting rent on existing tenant or lease it to any other additional third parties. They will be able to achieve a level of sublease, third-party lease income by acquiring a building that's slightly bigger than what they need. And that's the benefit of that, conversely to the risk that we just mentioned. And in order to move some of the tenants and provide, third-party tenant TI allowances, we'll use the same assumption that we use in the HQ expansion. So similarly, $20 a square foot that CalSTRS will be able to provide to third-party tenant. And when they need to reoccupy the space for their own use, it's going to be similar assumptions, $50 a square foot. And again, similar vacancy reserve or vacancy assumption in this acquisition scenario, about 20%. Again, 6% of downtime to lease up the space. So not 100, CalSTRS will not be, recognizing 100% of the sublease, third-party lease income in this case. Any other questions regarding the acquisition model? Okay. And moving on, walking you through the lease scenario. So keeping in mind that with the lease scenario, we also survey all the existing buildings in the Sacramento metro area that will fit CalSTRS needs. So we looked at only buildings that are lease certified and Class A based on a market classification. And based on the availability that we're seeing in the market today, the likely scenario is CalSTRS will have to occupy more than one buildings. And we may not, we don't know the exact, the actual buildings, and we don't know exactly where they are as of today, but we do know that based on our analysis, it's within the proximity that we have analyzed based on the current location, current tower. So they will not be more than 2 or 3 miles in terms of the radius distance from the existing building. Based on the availability in the market, we are looking at, the maximum capacity in the first building is 165,000 square feet, and whereas the second building, CalSTRS isn't going to take occupancy right away, but based on current availability in the market, we're looking at a potential square footage in the second building to be 148,500 square feet. And in order to achieve leasing the third-party space, CalSTRS will have to spend similar amount of the fit-out costs that they have spent in the HQ expansion as well as the acquisition scenario. So we use the same cost estimate based on dollar per square footage basis, and the only difference is the timing of these leasehold improvements will be spent. So the 175 or close to $176 million that you're seeing in the middle of the screen here will be spent over time between FY 2021 and throughout the 30-year analysis period. In terms of the operating expenses, because we want to be comparable to the other scenarios, so we assume the operating expenses is lower, is based on the same budgeted number of the existing tower. However, the reason why they are lower than the acquisition as well as the HQ expansion model is because a majority of these expenses has been achieved in the full service rent. So it's being paid through rent. And we wanted to kind of break out just the pure operating expense portion CalSTRS will be paying, and assume the building that CalSTRS will be leasing also has the same level of the Z&E requirement, so it will be able to achieve the reduction in electric savings by occupying buildings that are Z&E compliant. And therefore, the buildings from a leasing rate standpoint, we're looking at these buildings, CalSTRS is taking occupancy of these buildings is somewhere around FY 2020 and 21. And based on the current rent projection, we're looking at these building leasing rate at $3.21 per square foot, and with a 4% of annual increase. Any questions?
Questions? No questions. You can move to the next.
Okay, all right, okay. All right, so, all right, with that, yeah. With that, I wanted to kind of bring you over to the executive summary of our findings. Through our quantitative analysis, we were able to identify the total cash outflow across all three scenarios. So with HQ expansion, we were looking at over 30 years. Total cash flow for CalSTRS will be close to $78 million. With the acquisition model, we're looking at total cash outflow of close to $245 million. And with the leasing scenario, CalSTRS has to spend close to $511 million. Now, however, when we're discounting these nominal cash flow back to present value with the MPV analysis, we're looking at a much smaller difference between all three scenarios. So with the HQ expansion approaching $227 million, acquisition at $249 million, comparing to the leasing option at $161 million. And the difference between the HQ expansion and the leasing scenario is approximately $65.8 million. And the reason why we're seeing such a big difference comparing the total undiscounted cash flow is because we're discounting it back using a 7% discount rate. And with the leasing scenario, majority of the costs are spent over time, not upfront. Relatively in the HQ and acquisition options, majority of the costs are spent upfront. So in addition to these two metrics, we also wanted to introduce the average annual run rate, and what's included in the annual run rate number. It's based on an amortized cost, construction cost over 30-year period, and amortized purchase cost. Total occupancy expenses that includes rent expense, operating expense, third-party lease income, both from the office as well as from the parking standpoint. So with that, we are able to come up with the 30-year average of the annual run rate of $9.6 million for the HQ expansion, approaching $14 million for the acquisition, and $16.4 million for the lease scenario. Any other questions?
So if there's no questions before we go on from this slide, I'd really like to introduce someone in the audience that I'd like to come up and speak on this particular slide in general. His name is Kevin Savali with Stradling, Yoka, Carlson, and Roth. He is a bond counsel, and so just so the audience understands, since the printing of these materials, we have looked into the ability to finance that expansion or acquisition option using bond financing. And so Paul Rosenstiel had mentioned this to us before, that this was something that we could definitely pursue, and Brian Bartow, our general counsel, has been working with Kevin, and he's here to speak a little bit about the results of that.
Great. Just to get a little background, I'm a bond counsel, also a disclosure counsel of the state of California, and a lot of local governments, so I'm familiar with the area. We were asked to look at the potential viability for using tax-exempt proceeds to tax-exempt bonding to finance it, and it appears there's more work to do, but it appears that it's a viable path. CalSTRS seems to have the authority that it seems to that it needs to do that. This type of project is a project that's eligible for the use of tax-exempt financing under the federal tax code, and there are state issuers that have the authority to issue this kind of bond. So it looks like it again, there's more boxes to check, but it looks like this is a viable path. I'd suggest that if you think about doing tax-exempt financing, that you retain the services of a municipal advisor with particular expertise that can more finely hone exactly what that would cost you. But just by way of example, the state of California issued some general obligation bonds last week with an effective yield. It was slightly under 20 years the term, but under 3%. So it's if you go that route, or as part of your thinking, that's something that's probably worth considering.
Thank you.
So Lisa, just to be clear, so in November, we'll be coming back with not just these 3 options, but really 5 options at least, with a variation on funding the HQ expansion and
the acquisition option
through tax exempt.
That's correct. That's correct. So after conversations with Mr. Rosensteel, actually, we did reach out to the treasurer's office, and they were able to run some bond scenarios for us on the HQ expansion and acquisition based on what we think the upfront costs would be. And I can say, I don't want to throw out a real number, but because there's more details that need to be worked out before we know what the financing, when the proceeds are received and what kind of interest you would get on them. But it would make the HQ expansion and acquisition option much more favorable. To the tune, of maybe $50 million. So I think that's a very important aspect that we're going to be bringing back to you in November, just so that way you have both sides of the coin. And obviously the financing of this decision will make a difference in the bottom line and the cost to the organization.
I'm sorry. I do have some speakers that would like to ask questions. Jacqueline?
So I have 2 questions. The first I wanted to clarify, because Kevin, and I've lost your last name at this point,
Sure,
but Kevin, I did remember.
Kevin Worth.
Was that when you said this type of project is eligible for bond financing, you mean both the possible headquarters expansion and an acquisition, is that right?
Expansion, not acquisition.
So you don't think acquisition would be eligible for bond
We'd have
financing?
to look into it to sort of grossly oversimplify it.
Okay.
Tax-exempt financing has to be used for new projects as opposed to existing facilities.
I see. Okay, then I think I got confused between what you said and what Lisa said then about it, because you mentioned acquisition when you were just talking a minute ago.
I think there's a distinction between the ability to use bonds and tax-exempt bonds. Is that true?
Yes, there's you could potentially pursue taxable bonds for the acquisition, which still might offer again. A municipal advisor would have to advise you on that point, but there is a potential to do taxable bonds, which have a higher interest rate than taxable bonds, but still are often viewed as effective financing vehicles.
Okay, so thank you. This leads to sort of my second question. You're going to explain all of this in November, and Jack said maybe it's going to look like 5 options in November once all of these things are explained. And there's an expectation that at that same meeting where this is all being explained, the board will take a final vote in November. Is that what I'm hearing?
That's what we're hoping.
Okay. That just seems, I have some concerns about that kind of time frame, about this all coming for the next board meeting, separate from all of the packages we got for this board meeting, and then still there would be an expectation of making a final decision at that time, just speaking for myself.
Anything else, Jacqueline? Paul?
Thanks. Yeah, just sort of to build on what Kevin said, if we are going to pursue the concept of tax-exempt financing, Kevin deals with the legal issues. Do we have the legal authority to do this? The tax issues, do we have the legal authority to do this on a tax-exempt basis? But the financial analysis of the benefit of that is not in the wheelhouse of an attorney, it's in the wheelhouse of a financial or municipal advisor. So if we are going to pursue that, then I think we would need to engage that expertise as well to help inform us.
Lisa,
And by the way,
that's the plan?
It looks like, Kevin, you've changed your name. You're now Kevin Foster.
Yeah.
That's okay. It's Civale,
It's like you're Kevin.
C-I-V-A-L-E. Foster is much easier, so.
And that is the plan, to hire a financial person to get us
Yes, well,
that analysis?
we're gonna meet on that next week to figure out what's the easiest way to bring someone in to do
All
that
right.
for us.
Paul, did you have anything else?
No, that's it. Thank you.
Joy?
I just wanted to follow up on Jacqueline's question. What is the, why November? Why is a vote required in November?
Because so November was the date that we had thrown out when we were, it was actually just the sequencing of the timeframe in which we would have the information that we felt you needed to make the decision. And so the last time we met for a decision was November of 2016. And so we, had a lot of work to do since then. And so we assumed November 18 would be when we would have this type of information to provide you, which is really, all of the core pieces, all the core components to look at the best value for the organization moving forward.
Because I think that I'm excited at the opportunity that we're exploring, because it does seem really promising. But I think Jacqueline raises, an important point about just making sure that we take the time that we need to make the right decision. So I guess I understand that was the schedule that we laid out last year. And if there are any other considerations like, sort of other deadlines that this may jeopardize if we don't make a decision in November, those would be important to know as well. But I guess I just want to make sure that, people recognize we've been getting a lot of information, and knowing that we're going into a pretty deep dive today, but then are still going to get new information in November it's important we take the time to do it right.
We also have to deal with the budget. We're near exhaustion of the $8 million we allocated to the design. So, obviously, we have a construction company and an architect on. So if we extend it, we'd have to deal with those
And
expenses.
those are the kinds of things that I think would be important for us to know,
Yeah.
as opposed to, because it's the schedule we gave you a year ago.
Yeah. And because we've, I think on top of that, we've been working through this, like you said, 4 years. And at one time, the board wasn't comfortable moving ahead. And so we actually delayed it several years. And then staff came back to us, and Lisa and Jack, correct me if I get this totally whacked. Staff started realizing there were things happening in the market that we couldn't wait that long to come back, because they saw the cost starting to escalate. So we actually revisited that, moved that back another year. So a lot of what we've been talking about this last year, when we first talked about it, wasn't supposed to happen until next year. And so I think we do need to be aware that we've already seen between our initial estimate and what we're looking at now, how much that has grown. So I think it's really important for us to really, think about those timelines too, if we push it out too much further. All right. Giselle?
We also need to address our space constraints for staff.
Right.
And any of these options will take time to implement. And so if we need the time to move forward before we're out of space. So that's one of the things that we need to consider here.
All right. Nora?
2 questions. One, so is it possible, because I do agree with Jacqueline and Joy, that it is a lot of information to share, and then make a decision on that day if we have additional questions. Could we get some of this information at the October meeting? Because it seems like that would be a good time for us to be able to have it and process it, and then able to make a decision in November.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know that we could have the bond financing information to you as early as October, because I think that meeting is the 4th, 5th, and 6th.
2 weeks away.
2 weeks away. But definitely some of the other questions that have been asked, I think that we definitely can put something together and provide that to you early. So that way, maybe the bulk of the information that you're receiving in November isn't as large.
Thank you. And then the second question I have is related to the assumptions made about the future workforce. So I've been reading a lot around the future workforce actually looking very different than what we look at like now, in the next couple of years, including telecommuting viability, opportunities or flexibility. And there's been a lot of articles created, as part of what does the future of our workforce look like. And so I'm wondering, I know there may be some jobs that you cannot absolutely move, but has that assessment been made as well? So that, and what does that look like in the future for us?
So when we've modeled our growth, we are initially looking at a higher growth rate over the next 10 years, but that growth tapering off to a 2.5% rate in the future, because we know there's going to be economies of scale, and we won't continue to grow at this rate forever. However, at this point, the way we're operating, we're having a challenge identifying telework opportunities and areas where we'll be able to downsize or move functions off-site. And I will say that from our market research, we're finding that a lot of organizations that had moved to more of a telework model are moving those people back in-house. So it's not necessarily the best solution for every organization. Based on where we are right now, we believe that we will move forward as largely in the office. But we've put that conservative growth rate into our modeling because we just don't know every detail of the employment market over time.
Okay.
Anything else, Nora?
No, I'm just thinking.
I can
No worries.
add a little bit to that as well. So there's two different numbers we're looking at when we look at our projections and need for future square footage. So we are looking at the head count projection, and then we're also looking at the square footage per employee. And so currently CalSTRS is at 200 square feet per employee. We see that number coming down to 150 over the analysis period. And what that 150 does represent is a structured vacancy that allows for flexibility in space, as well as integrating things like shared seating, hotel desks to accommodate for any changes in telecommuting, teleworking, et cetera. So that is part of that square footage that we ultimately see required over time.
Thank you.
Paul?
Thank you. So I understand the idea of moving forward quickly because we think the costs are escalating, and then they have quite a bit in the last couple of years. Of course, we don't know what's going to happen in the future, whether they're going to continue to escalate, or if we go into a recession, if they're going to stop escalating or turn around. So I don't think that's the reason that we should be moving forward, because we're worried about cost increases because we don't know. I think we should move forward to the extent we need the space. But what I still haven't seen in the presentation is a sense of of benchmarking what we're doing here. Are we building a building where the layout and the number of square feet per employee is consistent with other state buildings? Are we building a building where the cost per square foot of construction is similar to other buildings? And so, I always ask, as everybody knows, I ask about benchmarks in every context, because giving the board numbers without a context doesn't enable us to make decisions as to whether the numbers make sense. So I'm not comfortable moving forward without benchmarks and comparisons. And so if you have those today, that'd be great. If you don't, then, I'd like to see them at some future meeting.
Okay.
Harry?
A more general question. Can you just speak a little bit about the process that you've gone through in terms of how you've tested all of the assumptions that are part of the entire vision of the project?
Sure. So the approach that we have adopted for testing and validating all the assumptions in this modeling process is we work with CalSTRS closely on coming up with, validating their headcount growth. That's largely contributing to the occupancy projection that was used in the model. So we had that internal validation with the CalSTRS team directly. And in addition to that, we work with our JLL markets as well as the research team validating any of the market assumption. The market assumption includes the validating the leasing rates that's in the marketplace, as well as any of the TI cost that's associated with leasing the existing building to a third party, as well as looking at comparing to the budget cost for CalSTRS that has spent on this building in particularly, relatively comparing to the HQ expansion as well as acquisition on how much it'll cost for these two scenarios to build out the space that meets the need, CalSTRS workplace requirement, as well also comparable to the standard that we have today. So that's the approach